Hey everyone, in today's video we are now also going to compare the brand new Intel iGPU, the Intel Arc B390 with the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 and its Radeon 8060S after I already compared it against the Z2 Extreme the other day. The new Intel iGPU comes with an Intel Core Ultra X9 388H in combination with 32GB of LPDDR5X 9600 megatransfers per second RAM inside an ASUS ZENBOOK Duo, while for the Strix Halo chip I was using a GPD Win 5 with 32GB of LPDDR5 7500 megatransfer RAM. And today the games will be compared at 17W, 35W and the chip's maximum TDP, which is around 45W for the Intel Arc B390 and around 75W for the Radeon 8060S. Oh, and for the AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 I was deactivating 10 of the 16 cores, since that way it just acts much more efficient and it even performs better, which you can actually see in this video here if you're interested. And I would have done that the same way for the Intel Core Ultra X9 388H if that would have been an option, but unfortunately it wasn't. So if a device ever enables that, I would love to retest that again. Before we're taking a closer look at the benchmarks, let's again have a look at the efficiency graphs for both devices first, for which I once again used Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 720p and high settings and tested both devices at all possible wattages. The Intel Arc B390 in blue, the AMD 8060S in yellow, and I also added the AMD Z2 for this graph today in red. In this game and this scenario, the Intel chip is taking the lead from around 10 to 20W, after which it's kinda trading blows with the 8060S, and at around 28 to 30W, the AMD chip just takes the lead and shows its muscles. This is not exactly the same for every game in today's video, but it's giving us a good idea of what to expect. The Z2 Extreme in the ASUS ROG LIX is able to keep up pretty well up until around 17W, and then it's losing ground. A similar picture at 1080p instead, the Intel Arc B390 is actually faster in the beginning, performing almost as fast at around 22 to 30W, and after that the Radeon 8060S is just unstoppable because it can really gain a lot of performance up until around 45 to 50W and still benefits from more watt up until around 65W. Also, a quick look at the efficiency curves in terms of FPS per watt. We can see that the Z2 can't keep up here, and the Intel chip really shines at lower wattages against the Strix Halo chip, meaning it could be pretty convincing in gaming handhelds, since here most people usually don't use more than 30W on battery. On contrary, 15 to 25 is what's important here. And while the AMD Radeon 8060S is a super fascinating APU, its first use case surely isn't gaming handhelds. However, at high wattages, the Intel Arc B390 is losing efficiency faster, since it just doesn't benefit a lot from more power after around 30W. In some games, there isn't even any performance difference between 35 and 45W for the Intel chip. Alright, the first game for today is Assassin's Creed Shadows, and I was using the low preset with FSR on performance at 1080p, and as we can see both chips perform about the same. But I have to talk about this once up front. As you can see, the RAM usage is way higher for the Intel chip. I'm not really sure why that is the case. That might be an issue with MSI Afterburner not being able to correctly read the RAM usage, or it's handling it differently than the AMD chip. However, at 17W both chips perform around the same, with 33 FPS on average for the AI Max Plus 395 and the Radeon 8060S, and 34 FPS on average for the Intel Arc B390 12xe, and that difference is basically within the margin of error. At 35W TDP, that's already a completely different image, with the AI Max Plus 395 taking a clear lead with 33% of performance advantage, with 69 FPS on average over only 52 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 12xe. However, both chips do have pretty convincing 1% lows, and the frame time graph looks really nice in that game, but to be honest, that's the case in almost every system I ever tested this game with. Using the same settings but giving the highest possible TDP that makes any sense to both chips, which is 45 watt for the Intel and 75 watt for the AMD Radeon chip. That's around 90 FPS on average for the 8060S, which is an advantage of 73% over the 52 FPS for the Intel Arc B390. And yes, 52 FPS is what we've already seen with 35 watt. So there was no performance gain here when using 10 watt more for the Intel Arc B390 12xe. Next up is a quick walk in the shooting range map of Arc Raiders using the medium preset and FSR on quality, and also XeSS on ultra quality for the Intel chip, which is doing the same resolution upscaling at 1080p. I've seen an average of 44 FPS for the AMD chip here and a pretty much convincing 52 FPS, which is 18% more for the Intel Arc B390 12xe. And in one of my previous videos, I've already noticed that this game is running really well on the Intel chip. So at the end of the day, a lot of the performance issues or performance gains comes down to the driver optimization that Intel is giving for these chips. And we will most likely see improvements over time, as it always has been the case. Now, while the AMD Radeon 8060S is taking a small lead at 35 watt, the Intel chip is actually keeping up pretty well, in my opinion, with an average of 91 FPS over the 97 FPS for the AMD chip, which is an advantage of 7%. In this game, we're actually seeing a slight improvement for the Intel Arc B390 when using 45 watt over 35 watt. It's an additional 6 FPS on average for a total of 97 FPS versus the 124 FPS the AMD Radeon 8060S can get with the maximum wattage, which now is a pretty clear lead of 28%, but it's not as high as in some other games. And again, I think that Intel is doing a great job for Arc Raiders using the Intel Arc B390 12xe. For Baldurs Gate 3, I was first using the medium preset with FSR on quality at 1080p for the 17 watt profile. And as you can see here, the Intel chip does struggle quite a bit with the 1% lows or the frame time graph. It's a pretty stuttery mess overall. The average FPS for the AMD chip is 33 FPS and 32 FPS for the Intel Arc B390, which is within the margin of error once again. Now switching over to the 35 watt TDP profile, we're seeing a difference of 9%, 58 FPS on average for the Radeon 8060S and 53 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 12xe here. While the additional wattage seems to help with the 1% lows quite a lot, as you can see in the frame time graph. For the 75 watt or 45 watt profiles, I was actually switching over to Vulkan and also using 1080p native, so no upscaling active here. And here you can see that the difference is pretty minimal still, even though we're at the highest possible TDP. And that is mostly because of how the game works. As you can see, the 8060S is not fully utilized. It's hovering around 57%, whereas for the Intel chip that's around 99 to 100%. So the Intel chip is really giving all it can, and the AMD chip is, for whatever reason, is kind of bored. It's not running as fast as it probably could, which is most likely due to the game's engine and how this game works. For Cyberpunk 2077, I was using the medium preset with FSR on quality at 1080p, and I saw an average of 47 FPS for the Radeon 8060S and an average of 39 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 12xe. So the AMD chip is leading with a performance advantage of 21% in this scenario at 17 watt. Now using the 35 watt TDP profile instead, we are now seeing a pretty high average FPS of 92 for the Radeon 8060S, which is 21% faster than the 76 FPS on average for the Intel Arc B390. And if you've been paying attention, that is the same advantage as with the 17 watt profiles. So for this game, for whatever reason, the Intel Arc chip is able to at least kind of keep up and not losing additional ground at higher wattages. Though with 75 watt, the AMD Radeon 8060S really starts flying with an average of 137 FPS, which is 76% faster now over the still slightly better 82 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 at 45 watt, which is a small gain at least of around 6 FPS over the 35 watt profile for the Intel chip. Using the 17 watt profile for CS2, In combination with the low preset and FSR activated, I saw a high average FPS of 170 for the Radeon 8060S, which is a advantage of 21% performance-wise over the Intel Arc B390 12xe, which had an average of 140 FPS here. While the Intel chip is doing pretty good at 35 watt as well, with 241 FPS, and probably thanks to its very good single core speed, it still can't reach the 310 FPS, which is 29% more of the Radeon 8060S in this scenario with 35 watt, once again using the low preset at 1080p and FSR activated. And running both chips with their maximum TDP that makes any sense, we see an average of 358 FPS for the Radeon 8060S versus an average of 253 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 12xe, so still quite a noticeable difference of 42% here. Next up is Forza Horizon 5, for which I was actually using the high preset with MSA 8x2 at 1080p. And this time I was actually using a 20 watt profile for both chips because I've lost some of my recordings for the Intel chip, so I had to go with 20 watt here instead. And we're seeing an average of 77 FPS for the Radeon 8060S and an average of 68 FPS for the Intel Arc B390. So there's a difference of around 13% using this 20 watt profile. However, as some of you have noticed, this is a pretty good result for the Intel chip, as usually AMD is much better in this game, but the Intel Arc B390 is actually doing pretty well in Forza Horizon 5. This is why we're already seeing a pretty high average of 95 FPS using the 35 watt profile for the Intel Arc B390 12xe, while still the 8060S Radeon here is again quite a bit faster, 32% on average, more FPS with 125 FPS. And here once again, it doesn't make any difference for the Intel Arc B390 chip when we're using 45 watt because it did get the same result with an average of 95 FPS for the Intel Arc B390. But the Radeon 8060S can gain a lot of more FPS with an average of now 154 FPS. So the difference is now 62%. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is pretty hard to run, but we're already getting an average of 49 FPS for the Radeon 8060S using the low preset with FSR on balanced at 1080p, while the Intel Arc B390 12xe is not performing as well here with an average of only 36 FPS. So there's a difference of already 36% using the 20 watt profile once again here in this scenario. And using the 35 watt profile, the difference is even bigger with now 49% advantage for the AMD Radeon 8060S with an average of 70 FPS here, while the Intel Arc B390 12xe does get playable FPS, but it's just not as high with 47 FPS. And only slightly better average of 50 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 here. That means we won't be able to get 60 FPS on average, at least with 1080p and FSR balanced, despite using the low preset. But that might be a driver issue. Once again, as these are very early drivers, we will probably see some improvements over the next few weeks and months. However, an average of 88 FPS, which is now 76% more FPS for the Radeon 8060S at 75 watt versus the 45 watt for the Intel Arc. Now next up is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for which I was using the medium preset at 1080p, where I saw an average of 48 FPS for the Radeon 8060S, which is 9% faster than the average 44 FPS the Intel Arc B390 12xe was able to achieve using the 17 watt profile first. Using the 35 watt profiles instead, we are now seeing a huge lead of 72% for the Radeon 8060S, which achieved already 100 FPS on average over the 58 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 12xe here. And a similar picture with the 75 watt or respectively 45 watt profile, though the Intel chip was able to gain quite a lot of FPS here. In this case, with the extra 10 watt at the end, we're seeing an average of 127 FPS for the Radeon 8060S and an average of 72 FPS for the Intel Arc B390 12xe, and that's a difference of 76%, which is almost as much as the 72% in the previous test. For The Last of Us Part 2, I was using the medium preset with FSR on balance at 1080p and saw an average FPS of 39 for the Radeon 8060S, which is 18% faster than the average of 33 FPS for the Intel Arc B390. While the frame time graph and the 1% lows have been pretty solid for both chips, even using the 17W profile only. Using the 35W profiles, we're now seeing an average of 80 FPS for the Radeon 8060S, which is 33% more than the average of 60 FPS, respectable result for the Intel Arc B390 12xe here. However, I only saw around 1 FPS more for the Intel Arc B390 using the 45W profile instead, so that's within the margin of error. But the Radeon 8060S of course did gain quite a lot of FPS using the 75W profile, so the maximum TDP with an average of now 109 FPS, which improved the lead to 79% over the Intel chip. And last but not least, I was of course testing The Witcher 3. I was using the medium preset in this case at 1080p, and I was using the old DirectX 11 version and not the next gen version because that just tanks the performance. I don't like that. I'm going with the old school version. So we're having an average of 53 FPS for the Radeon 8060S, and actually the Intel Arc B390 12xe is able to keep up here, having a tiny lead within the margin of error of 2%, so that's 1 FPS more, with an average of 54 FPS using the 17W profile. However, using the 35W profile, the Radeon 8060S is able to just about take the lead with an average of 105 FPS over 96, a difference of 9% here. However, that's a respectable result for the Intel Arc B390 12xe in my opinion. Very high FPS, we could even play this game on high settings. I actually tested in my previous video, I tested this game on this chip at 1440p and it still gave me playable FPS. And using the highest TDPs, 75W for the 8060S and 45W for the Intel Arc B390, I saw an average of 145 for the Radeon 8060S, which is 42% faster now than the average of 102 FPS for the Intel Arc B390. However, the Intel chip was once again able to at least gain some more FPS using the last 10 watts here. Alright, let's have a look at the average FPS for the 10 today's tested games. The Intel Arc B390 is able to really keep up with the more expensive AMD chip at 17W, which is kinda a sweet spot for gaming handhelds, though the Radeon 8060S still was around 11% faster on average, even though in 4 of the today's tested games, the Intel Arc B390 is actually faster at 17W. Setting the TDP to 35W already gives the Radeon 8060S a clear advantage of 110 versus 87 FPS, which is a lead of 27%, but the Intel chip definitely delivers very playable FPS in most games as well. And if we give the maximum wattage to both chips, which is 45W for the Intel and 75W for the AMD chip, Strix Halo clearly wins with a performance advantage of 51% on average, while at that level it basically has the performance of an NVIDIA RTX 4060 Mobile. However, I do think the B390 actually can reach a, at least low-powered RTX 4050 in some scenarios, and maybe I'll do that comparison in the future as well. Alright, and that's all for today. Make sure to check out my previous videos about the Intel Arc B390 and don't forget to like the video if you like the content or at least found it helpful. Thank you very much. Also, thanks a lot for watching until the very end. Stay safe, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.